Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for over 12 years, and in that time he had witnessed virtually every conceivable family dynamic play out on his stage. He had seen playful competition between siblings, good-natured teasing between parents and children, and the occasional moment of tension that quickly dissolved into laughter. But on that Wednesday afternoon in December 2024, Steve would find himself standing between two people whose accumulated resentment and unresolved conflict would explode into a full-scale argument in front of cameras, studio audience, and eventually millions of viewers. The Peterson family from Michigan stood ready to compete, appearing cheerful and united under the studio lights. What was about to unfold would become one of the most dramatic and ultimately transformative moments in the show's history, a moment when Steve Harvey would have to draw upon every ounce of his wisdom and experience to prevent a marriage from completely unraveling on national television. Before we continue with this powerful story about conflict, communication, and the courage to change, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these important stories with families who need to hear them. The Peterson family presented themselves as a typical middle-class American family as they took their positions at the podium. James Peterson, age 48, was a high school principal whose authoritative bearing and confident demeanor suggested someone accustomed to being in charge and having his opinions respected. Beside him stood his wife Margaret, age 46, a registered nurse whose capable hands and observant eyes reflected years of managing medical emergencies and difficult patients. Their 3 children completed the team: their daughter Emily at 24, their son Thomas at 21, and their youngest daughter Rachel at 18. The family had driven from Detroit specifically for this taping, and according to their pre-show interviews, they had been looking forward to this experience for months after being selected from thousands of applicants. Steve Harvey had greeted the Peterson family during the pre-show warm-up period, as he did with all contestants, shaking hands and engaging in light conversation to help everyone relax before filming began. During this interaction, he had noticed an undercurrent of tension between James and Margaret that was subtle but unmistakable to someone with Steve's experience reading people. When Steve had asked a playful question about who was the better driver in the family, James had immediately answered that he was, while Margaret had simultaneously said that she was, and both had spoken with an edge that suggested this was not the first time they had disagreed on this particular point. The moment had passed quickly with laughter from the children, but Steve had filed away the observation that there might be some competitive tension between the couple. The game began with the energy and excitement that characterized Family Feud. Both the Peterson family and their competitors, the Rodriguez family from California, were playing enthusiastically and answering questions with reasonable success. Steve delivered his signature humor and kept the atmosphere light and entertaining. But as the game progressed, Steve began to notice a pattern in how James and Margaret Peterson interacted with each other that went beyond normal family competitiveness. When Margaret gave an answer that was not on the board, James would visibly sigh and shake his head in a way that communicated disappointment bordering on disdain. When James gave an incorrect answer, Margaret would make a face that suggested she had known his response would be wrong and could have done better herself. The tension became more pronounced during the third round when both James and Margaret were called to the face-off position at the center podium to compete for control of the question. Steve asked the survey question, which was name something people argue about in cars. James buzzed in first and answered directions, which was the #1 answer on the board. This should have been a moment of triumph for the family, but before Steve could even congratulate James or ask him to choose whether to play or pass, Margaret spoke up loudly enough for her microphone to catch her words clearly. Margaret said that she had been about to say directions as well, and that if she had been just slightly faster on the buzzer, she would have gotten the #1 answer. The comment was delivered in a tone that suggested she deserved credit for thinking of the right answer, even though James had buzzed in first. James turned to look at his wife with an expression that mixed irritation and something that looked like long-suppressed frustration. He responded that he had in fact buzzed in first, that his answer had been correct, and that there was no award for almost answering or for thinking of the same answer someone else said first. The exchange happened quickly and might have been dismissed as competitive banter, except for the obvious hostility in both voices. Steve Harvey intervened immediately with a joke about married couples always wanting credit for everything, which generated laughter from the audience and seemed to diffuse the moment. The game continued with the Peterson family choosing to play the question. But Steve had recognized that what he had just witnessed was not playful competition but genuine animosity, and he watched the couple carefully as the round progressed. The situation deteriorated rapidly during the playing of that same question. The survey question was, name something people argue about in cars, and the Peterson family had revealed the #1 answer of directions. As the family worked through the remaining answers on the board, they revealed radio station, temperature controls, and driving too fast or slow. They had one strike and needed one more answer to clear the board and win the round. It was Margaret's turn at the podium, and she gave the answer, who's driving, which seemed like a reasonable response given the question. However, the answer was not on the board, giving the family their second strike. James Peterson's reaction to his wife's incorrect answer was immediate and harsh. He threw up his hands in a gesture of frustration and said loudly, "Of course that's not on the board. Nobody argues about who's driving. That doesn't even make sense." The criticism was delivered with contempt that shocked the studio audience into silence. Margaret's face flushed red, and she turned to face her husband directly rather than the game board. She responded that his criticism was completely inappropriate, and that her answer had made perfect sense since many families did indeed argue about who was going to drive on trips. What happened next occurred so quickly that Steve Harvey barely had time to react. James shot back that Margaret's answer had been stupid, and that she should think before speaking instead of just blurting out whatever came into her head. Margaret responded that if anyone was stupid, it was James for thinking he was always right about everything, when in fact he was often wrong but too arrogant to admit it. James said that at least he did not give ridiculous answers on national television and embarrass the entire family. Margaret said that the only embarrassment to the family was James's constant need to criticize and belittle everyone around him, especially her. The Peterson children stood frozen at the podium, their faces showing shock and mortification as their parents' argument escalated. The studio audience sat in uncomfortable silence, uncertain whether this was somehow part of the show or a genuine marital conflict erupting in real time. The Rodriguez family at the opposite podium looked equally uncomfortable, clearly not knowing where to direct their eyes or how to respond to what they were witnessing. And Steve Harvey stood at the center of it all, his expression having shifted from his usual playful demeanor to something much more serious and concerned. Steve attempted to intervene, raising his hand and speaking in a firm voice to stop the argument. He said both their names loudly, James, Margaret, trying to cut through their heated exchange and redirect their attention to him. But both spouses ignored him completely, too caught up in their escalating argument to register that the host was trying to stop them. James continued that Margaret always took everything personally and could never accept constructive criticism. Margaret fired back that there was nothing constructive about constantly being told you were wrong, stupid, or embarrassing, and that James's so-called criticism was actually just verbal abuse that she had been tolerating for far too long. The argument had now gone far beyond the incorrect game show answer that had triggered it. Margaret began listing examples of times James had criticized or belittled her in front of others. She mentioned a family dinner where he had corrected her grammar in front of their adult children. She brought up a party where he had told other guests that Margaret was terrible with technology, and then proceeded to demonstrate how she could not figure out a simple app on her phone. She described multiple occasions where James had overruled her parenting decisions in front of their children, undermining her authority and making her look incompetent. James defended himself by saying that he was simply being honest, and that if Margaret did not want to be corrected, she should stop being wrong so frequently. He accused her of being overly sensitive and unable to handle even the mildest feedback. He brought up his own grievances, complaining that Margaret was constantly questioning his decisions and second-guessing his judgment on everything from finances to household repairs. He said that he could not do anything without Margaret providing unsolicited commentary on how he should have done it differently or better. Steve Harvey made another attempt to stop the argument, this time speaking even more forcefully and stepping between the couple physically. He told them in no uncertain terms that they needed to stop immediately, that this was not appropriate for the setting, and that they needed to remember where they were and who was watching. But his words seemed to have minimal impact. James and Margaret were so deeply engaged in their conflict, so caught up in expressing years of accumulated resentment, that external intervention barely registered. The production team was in chaos behind the scenes. The director was unsure whether to cut away from the argument or keep cameras rolling on what was clearly a genuine human drama unfolding. The producers were debating whether to call a break or let the situation play out. The audience sat riveted, watching what felt like a car crash happening in slow motion. And Steve Harvey, one of the most experienced and capable hosts in television history, was facing a situation that went far beyond normal hosting challenges and required genuine intervention to prevent serious harm. Margaret's voice had risen in both volume and pitch as she continued to detail years of feeling disrespected and diminished by her husband. She talked about how James treated her opinions as less valuable than his own, how he dismissed her feelings as overreactions, and how he seemed to take pleasure in proving her wrong in front of others. She said that being married to James felt like being perpetually auditioned for a role she could never quite succeed at, constantly being evaluated and found wanting. The pain in her voice was raw and genuine, suggesting that this was not manufactured drama but real anguish finally being expressed after years of suppression. James responded with his own list of complaints about their marriage. He talked about how Margaret was constantly critical of him, questioning his decisions, and implying that he was incompetent or thoughtless. He said that nothing he did was ever good enough for her, that she always found something to criticize or improve. He described feeling like he could never relax in his own home because Margaret was always pointing out things he had done wrong or forgotten to do. He accused her of being a perfectionist who made everyone around her feel inadequate, including him and their children. The argument had become a full-scale airing of marital grievances, with each spouse using the public platform to express frustrations that had clearly been building for years. The children were openly crying now, with their daughter Emily trying to approach her parents to stop them, while their son Thomas stood with his head down, apparently wishing he could disappear. The youngest daughter, Rachel, had her hands over her ears, visibly overwhelmed by witnessing her parents' marriage disintegrating in such a public and painful way. Steve Harvey recognized that the situation required drastic intervention. He signaled forcefully to the production team to stop filming and called for an immediate break. The cameras stopped rolling, though the situation on stage remained chaotic for several more minutes. Steve positioned himself physically between James and Margaret, using his presence to create space and hopefully interrupt the cycle of attack and counterattack they had fallen into. He spoke to them in a voice that was firm but not angry, telling them that what was happening needed to stop immediately for the sake of their children, if not for themselves. The urgency and authority in Steve's voice finally seemed to penetrate through James and Margaret's anger. Both fell silent, breathing heavily, faces flushed from the emotional intensity of their confrontation. The studio was eerily quiet as everyone processed what had just occurred. Steve asked the Peterson children to step off the stage temporarily and have a staff member take them to a private area where they could compose themselves. The children left reluctantly, casting worried looks back at their parents as they exited. Once the children were out of earshot, Steve spoke to James and Margaret with complete honesty about what he had just witnessed. He told them that their argument on stage was one of the most painful things he had seen in his career, not because of the conflict itself, but because of what it revealed about the state of their marriage and the depth of pain both of them were carrying. He said that the level of contempt and disrespect they had shown each other was toxic, and that if they continued in that pattern, their marriage would not survive. More importantly, he pointed out that their children had just witnessed their parents publicly attacking each other with no regard for how that display would affect them, and that damage needed to be addressed immediately. Steve's words seemed to have a sobering effect on both James and Margaret. The reality of what they had just done, the public nature of their argument, and the pain they had inflicted on their children began to sink in. Margaret started crying, not the angry tears from the argument, but tears of shame and regret. James put his head in his hands, his shoulders sagging as the adrenaline from the confrontation drained away and was replaced by awareness of the consequences of what had just transpired. Steve Harvey then did something that demonstrated why he was more than just a game show host, but a genuine leader with deep wisdom about human relationships. He told James and Margaret that they had a choice to make in this moment. They could continue down the path they had been on, treating each other with contempt and disrespect until their marriage ended in divorce, and their children were permanently scarred by witnessing their parents' mutual destruction. Or they could choose to acknowledge that they needed serious help, that their communication patterns were destructive, and that saving their marriage would require professional intervention and genuine commitment from both of them to change. Steve spoke about marriage in terms that reflected his own experience and hard-won wisdom. He acknowledged that all marriages had conflict, and that disagreement was normal and even healthy when handled appropriately. But what he had witnessed was not healthy conflict. It was mutual character assassination, with each spouse trying to hurt the other as deeply as possible in retaliation for their own pain. That pattern, Steve explained, would destroy any relationship it touched because it eroded trust, respect, and the basic goodwill that made people want to stay together through difficult times. Steve asked each of them directly whether they wanted to stay married or whether this public argument was actually their way of ending a relationship they no longer wanted to be in. The question was stark and demanding, requiring honest self-examination rather than allowing them to continue operating on autopilot. James was the first to respond, saying through his own tears that he did love Margaret and did want their marriage to work, but that he felt constantly criticized and inadequate and did not know how to fix that dynamic. Margaret responded that she too loved James and wanted their marriage to survive, but that she needed him to see her as an equal partner worthy of respect rather than as someone whose role was to defer to his superior judgment. These admissions represented the first genuine vulnerability either had shown during the entire encounter. For the first time, they were expressing underlying needs and fears rather than simply attacking each other's character. Steve recognized this shift and built on it. He asked them if they were willing to do whatever it took to save their marriage, including intensive counseling, changing deeply ingrained communication patterns, and being vulnerable enough to admit when they were wrong. Both James and Margaret agreed that they were willing, though their voices conveyed uncertainty about whether they were actually capable of making such significant changes. Steve then made a decision about how to handle the situation from a production standpoint. He told James and Margaret that the Family Feud episode would not air in its current form. The public argument would not be broadcast for entertainment purposes. However, he suggested that they consider allowing a special episode of his talk show to document their journey toward healing, with the understanding that sharing their struggle might help other couples who were trapped in similar patterns of destructive conflict. Both James and Margaret agreed to this proposal, recognizing that if their pain could serve a purpose in helping others, it might give meaning to the damage they had caused. Steve then called the Peterson children back onto the stage and facilitated a conversation between parents and children about what had just occurred. He helped James and Margaret apologize sincerely to their children for subjecting them to such a painful and inappropriate display. The parents acknowledged that their behavior had been wrong, that their children should never have had to witness that level of conflict, and that they were committed to getting help and changing their patterns. The children responded with a mixture of relief and residual pain, clearly wanting to believe their parents could fix their marriage, but also scarred by what they had witnessed. The episode of Steve Harvey's talk show that documented the Peterson family's journey aired 6 months after the original Family Feud taping. The episode began with James and Margaret describing the state of their marriage before the fateful game show appearance, acknowledging patterns of mutual criticism and contempt that had developed over years. They explained that small resentments had accumulated over time, with neither spouse addressing problems directly until the frustration built to explosive levels. The game show argument, while shocking in its public nature, was actually not atypical of how they argued at home, though usually without the added element of cameras and audience. The couple described the intensive marriage counseling they had undertaken in the months following the incident. They had worked with a therapist who specialized in high-conflict couples and who had introduced them to concepts from the Gottman method of relationship counseling. The therapist had helped them understand that the contempt and criticism they showed each other were among the most destructive forces in any relationship, reliably predicting divorce if left unchanged. James and Margaret had to learn entirely new ways of communicating, expressing needs without attacking character, and listening to each other's concerns without becoming immediately defensive. One of the most significant breakthroughs in their counseling had come when the therapist helped them understand the underlying fears and insecurities driving their destructive behavior. James's constant criticism of Margaret stemmed from his own deep-seated fear of being incompetent or wrong, which made him hypersensitive to any suggestion that he had made a mistake. His way of managing that fear was to deflect attention onto Margaret's errors, positioning himself as the authority figure who corrected others rather than someone who might need correction himself. Understanding this pattern did not excuse his behavior, but it helped both James and Margaret see that his criticism was more about his own insecurity than about any actual deficiency in Margaret. Similarly, Margaret's constant second-guessing of James's decisions stemmed from her childhood experience of feeling powerless and unheard. Her father had been authoritarian and dismissive of her mother's opinions, and Margaret had internalized a belief that the only way to have influence was to constantly assert yourself and question others' authority. By chronically challenging James, she was trying to ensure she would not be dominated or dismissed the way her mother had been. Again, understanding this pattern did not justify the behavior, but it helped both spouses see that the conflict was not really about who was right about any particular issue, but about deeper needs for respect and autonomy. The counseling had given James and Margaret specific tools for managing conflict more constructively. They had learned to use "I feel" statements rather than "you always" accusations. They had practiced taking breaks during arguments before emotions escalated to destructive levels. They had worked on assumption of positive intent, choosing to believe that their spouse was generally trying to be helpful or supportive rather than malicious, even when the impact of their behavior was negative. They had learned to apologize genuinely when they made mistakes rather than deflecting or making excuses. The transformation in their relationship was visible during the talk show episode. When Steve asked them to demonstrate how they might handle a disagreement now versus before counseling, the difference was remarkable. Previously, if James had suggested a different route to take while driving, Margaret would have responded with sarcasm about his constant need to be right. Now she was able to say, "I appreciate you trying to help. I actually prefer this route because it avoids highway traffic, but I understand your suggestion." James's response was equally different. Rather than insisting his way was better, he acknowledged Margaret's reasoning and accepted her choice without resentment. The Peterson children also participated in the talk show episode, sharing their perspective on their parents' transformation. All three described the relief of being in a home where arguments no longer escalated to shouting matches filled with personal attacks. They talked about how their parents' destructive communication patterns had affected them, making them anxious about conflict and uncertain about whether healthy relationships were even possible. Seeing their parents work to change had given them hope and had provided them with a model for how to repair damaged relationships rather than simply abandoning them. The episode generated an enormous response from viewers. Tens of thousands of couples reached out through social media and email to share that they recognized their own destructive patterns in the Petersons' story. Many described similar cycles of criticism and defensiveness that had poisoned their relationships. The episode prompted a significant increase in couples seeking marriage counseling, with many therapists reporting that clients specifically mentioned the Peterson family as the catalyst that convinced them to get professional help before their own conflicts became irreparable. Relationship experts praised the episode for several reasons. First, it showed that destructive communication patterns could be changed even in long-established relationships if both partners were willing to do the work. Second, it demonstrated the value of professional counseling in providing tools and frameworks that couples could not typically develop on their own. Third, it illustrated how underlying issues and historical wounds often drove surface-level conflicts, and that addressing those deeper issues was essential for lasting change. The episode also sparked important conversations about the normalization of contempt and criticism in relationships. Many couples did not recognize how damaging these patterns were because they seemed so commonplace. Seeing the Petersons' argument and recognizing the pain it caused helped people understand that just because certain behavior was common did not mean it was acceptable or sustainable. The episode provided a reference point for people to evaluate their own relationships and ask whether their communication patterns were healthy or destructive. Steve Harvey reflected extensively on the Peterson family incident in subsequent interviews. He described it as one of the most challenging moments in his career, requiring him to make quick decisions about how to handle a situation that went far beyond normal hosting duties. He explained that his decision to stop filming and intervene directly had been instinctive, driven by concern for the couple's children and recognition that what was happening was genuinely harmful rather than entertaining. He had been willing to sacrifice the dramatic footage and potential ratings because using someone's marriage crisis as entertainment would have violated his own values about how to treat people with dignity. Steve also spoke about why he had offered to help the Peterson family through his talk show rather than simply ending their involvement with his productions entirely. He explained that he believed in second chances and in the possibility of redemption and growth. James and Margaret had made terrible choices in how they handled their conflict, but they had also shown willingness to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to change. Steve felt that supporting their journey toward healing and sharing that journey with viewers who might benefit from seeing it was a more productive response than simply condemning them for their behavior. 1 year after the original Family Feud incident, James and Margaret Peterson appeared on Steve Harvey's talk show for a 1-year update. The couple reported that they were still actively working on their relationship, but that the work had become easier as new communication patterns became more habitual. They still attended counseling monthly as a form of ongoing maintenance and accountability. Both described their marriage as fundamentally different from what it had been before the crisis, built now on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than on power struggle and competition. James spoke candidly about how difficult it had been to examine his own behavior and acknowledge the harm he had caused. He described having to confront the reality that his treatment of Margaret had been verbally and emotionally abusive, even though he had never thought of himself as an abusive person. Coming to terms with that truth had required genuine humility and willingness to accept that his impact mattered more than his intent. He had to learn to measure his success as a husband not by whether he felt he was trying his best, but by whether Margaret felt loved, respected, and valued. Margaret shared her own journey of learning to express her needs and concerns without resorting to criticism and control. She had recognized that her constant second-guessing of James had been a form of trying to manage her own anxiety about being powerless. Learning to tolerate the discomfort of letting James make decisions she might not have chosen herself, while still maintaining her own voice and autonomy, had been challenging but essential. She had learned to distinguish between genuine problems that needed to be addressed and minor differences in preference or style that could be let go. The Peterson children spoke about the impact of their parents' transformation on their own developing relationships. Emily, the eldest, had recently become engaged and described how witnessing her parents' struggle and recovery had influenced her approach to her own relationship. She and her fiancé, Atilda Copyright, had agreed to attend premarital counseling to develop healthy communication skills before problems developed rather than waiting until patterns became destructive. Thomas spoke about how his parents' example had taught him that asking for help was a sign of strength rather than weakness. Rachel, the youngest, said that seeing her parents fight to save their marriage rather than giving up when things got hard had shaped her belief that commitment meant working through difficulties rather than simply avoiding them. The Peterson family story became a powerful teaching tool in marriage counseling programs and relationship education courses. Therapists used clips from both the game show Argument and the subsequent talk show episodes to illustrate the difference between destructive and constructive conflict. The dramatic nature of the Petersons' public argument made the consequences of contempt and criticism viscerally clear in a way that academic discussion often could not achieve. The couple's subsequent transformation demonstrated that change was possible even after years of destructive patterns. The story also had a lasting impact on how Steve Harvey approached his role as host of Family Feud. He became more attuned to signs of serious marital distress versus normal competitive tension between spouses. He had his production team undergo training to recognize warning signs of domestic conflict that might require intervention rather than simply being filmed for entertainment. While the Peterson situation was extreme and unlikely to recur, Steve wanted to ensure that his show never again inadvertently provided a platform for genuine harm to occur without appropriate intervention. The incident also influenced broader conversations about reality television and the ethics of filming real human conflict for entertainment purposes. Critics had long argued that reality television exploited people's genuine struggles for ratings and profit. The Peterson family situation provided a concrete example of how easily a game show appearance could become something much more serious and potentially harmful. The fact that Steve Harvey had chosen not to air the argument and had instead used his platform to support the family's healing suggested a more ethical approach to handling unscripted human drama when it occurred on camera. 5 years after the original incident, the Peterson family had become advocates for healthy communication in marriage. They led workshops at their church and in their community, teaching other couples the skills they had learned in counseling. They were open about the fact that they still had conflicts and disagreements, but they had learned to handle those conflicts in ways that strengthened rather than damaged their relationship. They emphasized that the work of maintaining a healthy marriage was ongoing and required consistent attention and effort, not a one-time fix. James and Margaret also maintained contact with Steve Harvey, periodically updating him on their progress and thanking him for his intervention at a critical moment in their marriage. They credited him with literally saving their family by refusing to allow their destructive argument to continue unchecked and by offering them support and resources to change. Steve, characteristically humble, deflected credit back to them for doing the actual hard work of transformation. He acknowledged that all he had done was hold up a mirror and offer a path forward. They had to choose to walk that path themselves. The Peterson family story stands as a testament to several important truths about marriage and relationships. First, that destructive communication patterns can develop gradually over years, becoming normalized even as they poison the relationship. Second, that contempt and criticism are relationship killers that must be addressed directly and urgently. Third, that even marriages that seem irreparably damaged can be healed if both partners commit to genuine change and seek professional help. Fourth, that crisis can be an opportunity for transformation if people are willing to use it as a catalyst for growth rather than simply as confirmation that the relationship is doomed. The story also demonstrates the power of intervention by someone who cares enough to speak truth even when it is uncomfortable. Steve Harvey could have allowed the argument to continue, could have treated it as dramatic content for good television. Instead, he chose to stop the filming, address the harm being caused, and offer genuine support for healing. That choice reflected values about human dignity and the responsibility that comes with having a platform and influence. Perhaps most importantly, the Peterson family story gave hope to thousands of couples who recognized themselves in James and Margaret's destructive patterns. It demonstrated that change was possible even when things seemed hopeless, that professional help worked when people were genuinely committed to the process, and that choosing to fight for a marriage rather than simply walking away from conflict could lead to something stronger and better than what existed before. If this story has resonated with you, or if you recognize patterns of contempt and criticism in your own relationship, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about real families facing real challenges. Share this with someone who needs to understand that destructive communication patterns can be changed, that seeking help is a sign of strength, and that marriages can heal even after serious damage if both partners commit to doing the work. Your relationship deserves respect, healthy communication, and the investment of effort required to build something that lasts.